30. Penetrate their minds. Communication strategies. Communication is a kind of war. Its field of battle, the resistant and defensive minds of the people you want to influence. The goal is to advance, to penetrate their defenses and occupy their minds. Anything else is ineffective communication, self-indulgent talk. Learn to infiltrate your ideas behind enemy lines, sending messages through little details, luring people into coming to the conclusions you desire, and into thinking they've gotten there by themselves. Some you can trick by cloaking your extraordinary ideas in ordinary forms. Others, more resistant and dull, must be awoken with extreme language that bristles with newness. At all cost, avoid language that is static, preachy, and overly personal. Make your words a spark for action, not passive contemplation. Visceral communication. To work with the film director Alfred Hitchcock for the first time was generally a disconcerting experience. He did not like to talk much on the sets of his movies, just the occasional sardonic and witty remark. Was he deliberately secretive, or just quiet? And how could someone direct a film which entails ordering so many people about without talking a lot and giving explicit instructions? This peculiarity of Hitchcock's was most troublesome for his actors. Many of them were used to film directors coddling them, discussing in detail the characters they were to play and how to get into the role. Hitchcock did none of this. In rehearsals, he said very little. On the set, too, actors would glance over at him for his approval, only to find him napping or looking bored. According to the actress Thelma Ritter, if Hitchcock liked what you did, he said nothing. If he didn't, he looked like he was going to throw up. And yet somehow, in his own indirect way, he would get his actors to do precisely what he wanted. On the first day of shooting for the 39 Steps in 1935, Hitchcock's two leads, Madeleine Carroll and Robert Donat, arrived on the set a little tense. That day, they were to act in one of the movie's more complex scenes, playing relative strangers who, however, have gotten handcuffed together earlier in the plot, and, still handcuffed, were forced to run through the Scottish countryside, actually a sound stage, to escape the film's villains. Hitchcock had given them no real sign of how he wanted them to act the scene. Carroll, in particular, was bothered by the director's behavior. This English actress, one of the most elegant film stars of the period, had spent much of her career in Hollywood, where directors had treated her like royalty. Hitchcock, on the other hand, was distant, hard to figure out. She had decided to play the scene with an air of dignity and reserve, the way she thought a lady would respond to the situation of being handcuffed to a strange man. To get over her nervousness, she chatted warmly with Donat, trying to put both him and herself in a collaborative mood. When Hitchcock arrived on set, he explained the scene to the two actors, snapped a pair of handcuffs on them, and proceeded to lead them through the set, across a dummy bridge, and among other props. Then, in the middle of his demonstration, he was suddenly called away to attend to a technical matter. He would return soon. They should take a break. He felt in his pockets for the key to the handcuffs, but no, he must have mislaid it, and off he hurried, ostensibly to find the key. Hours went by. Donat and Carroll became increasingly frustrated and embarrassed. Suddenly, they had no control, a most unusual feeling for two stars on set. While even the humblest crew members were free to go about their business, the two stars were shackled together. Their forced intimacy and discomfort made their earlier banter impossible. They could not even go to the bathroom. It was humiliating. Hitchcock returned in the afternoon. He had found the key. Shooting began, but as the actors went to work, it was hard for them to get over the experience of that day. The movie star's usual cool unflappability was gone. Carroll had forgotten all her ideas about how to play the scene, and yet, despite her and Donat's anger, the scene seemed to flow with unexpected naturalness. Now they knew what it was like to be tied together. They had felt the awkwardness, so there was no need to act it. It came from within. 4 years later, Hitchcock made Rebecca with Joan Fontaine and Laurence Olivier. Fontaine, at 21, was taking her first leading role, and she was horribly nervous about playing opposite Olivier, who was widely recognized as an actor of genius. Another director might have eased her insecurities, but Hitchcock was seemingly doing the opposite. He chose to pass along gossip from the rest of the cast and crew. No one thought she was up to the job, he told her, and Olivier had really wanted his wife, Vivien Leigh, to get her part. Fontaine felt terrified, isolated, unsure, exactly the qualities of her character in the film. She hardly needed to act, and her memorable performance in Rebecca was the start of a glorious career. Clearly, Hitchcock mistrusted language and explanation, preferring action to words as a way of communicating, and this preference extended to the form and content of his films. That gave his screenwriters a particularly hard time. After all, putting the film into words was their job. In story meetings, Hitchcock would discuss the ideas he was interested in, themes like people's doubleness, their capacity for both good and evil, the fact that no one in this world is truly innocent. The writers would produce pages of dialogue expressing these ideas elegantly and subtly, only to find them edited out in favor of actions and images. In Vertigo, 1958, and Psycho, 1960, for example, Hitchcock inserted mirrors in many scenes. In Spellbound, 1945, it was shots of ski tracks and other kinds of parallel lines. The murder in Strangers on a Train, 1951, was revealed through its reflection in a pair of glasses. For Hitchcock, evidently, images like these revealed his ideas of the doubleness in the human soul better than words did, but on paper this seemed somewhat contrived. On set, the producers of Hitchcock's films often watched in bewilderment as the director moved the camera, not the actors, to stage his scenes. It seemed to make no sense, as if he loved the technical side of filmmaking more than dialogue and the human presence. Nor could editors fathom his obsession with sounds, colors, the size of the actors' heads within the frame, the speed with which people moved. He seemed to favor these endless visual details over the story itself. And then the film would be a finished product, and suddenly everything that had seemed peculiar about his method made perfect sense. Audiences often responded to Hitchcock's films more deeply than they did to the work of any other director. The images, the pacing, the camera movements swept them along and got under their skin. A Hitchcock film was not just seen, it was experienced, and it stayed in the mind long after the viewing. Interpretation. In interviews, Hitchcock often told the story about his childhood. When he was around 6, his father, upset at something he had done, sent him to the local police station with a note. The officer on duty read the note and locked little Alfred in a cell, telling him, "This is what we do to naughty boys." He was released after just a few minutes, but the experience marked him indelibly. Had his father yelled at him, as most boys' fathers did, he would have become defensive and rebellious. But leaving him alone, surrounded by frightening authority figures, in a dark cell, with its unfamiliar smells, that was a much more powerful way to communicate. As Hitchcock discovered, to teach people a lesson, to really alter their behavior, you must alter their experience, aim at their emotions, inject unforgettable images into their minds, shake them up. To communicate in a deep and real way, you must bring people back to their childhood, when they were less defensive and more impressed by sounds, images, actions, a world of pre-verbal communication. It requires speaking a kind of language composed of actions, all strategically designed to affect people's moods and emotions, what they can least control. That is precisely the language Hitchcock developed and perfected over the years. With actors, he wanted to get the most natural performance out of them. In essence, get them not to act. To tell them to relax or be natural would have been absurd. It would only have made them more awkward and defensive than they already were. Instead, just as his father had gotten him to feel terror in a London police station, he got them to feel the emotions of the movie: frustration, isolation, loss of inhibition. Of course he hadn't mislaid the handcuffs keys somewhere on the set of the 39 Steps, as Donat later found out. The supposed loss was a strategy. Instead of prodding actors with irritating words, which come from the outside and are pushed away, Hitchcock made these feelings part of their inner experience, and this communicated immediately on screen. With audiences, too, Hitchcock never preached a message. Instead, he used the visual power of film to return them to that childlike state when images and compelling symbols had such a visceral effect. It is imperative in life's battles to be able to communicate your ideas to people, to be able to alter their behavior. Communication is a form of warfare. In verbal terms, most people wage a kind of medieval warfare, using words, pleas, and calls for attention like battle axes and clubs to hit people over the head. But in being so direct, they only make their targets more resistant. Instead, you must learn to fight indirectly and unconventionally, tricking people into lowering their defenses, hitting their emotions, altering their experience, dazzling them with images, powerful symbols, and visceral sensory cues. Bringing them back to that childlike state, when they were more vulnerable and fluid, the communicated idea penetrates deep behind their defenses. Because you are not fighting the usual way, you will have an unusual power. Keys to warfare. What you need to pay attention to is not simply the content of your communication, but the form, the way you lead people to the conclusions you desire, rather than telling them the message in so many words. If you want people to change a bad habit, for example, much more effective than simply trying to persuade them to stop is to show them, perhaps by mirroring their bad behavior in some way, how annoying that habit feels to other people. If you want to make people with low self-esteem feel better about themselves, praise has a superficial effect. Instead, you must prod them into accomplishing something tangible, giving them a real experience. That will translate into a much deeper feeling of confidence. If you want to communicate an important idea, you must not preach. Instead, make your readers or listeners connect the dots and come to the conclusion on their own. Make them internalize the thought you are trying to communicate. Make it seem to emerge from their own minds. Such indirect communication has the power to penetrate deep behind people's defenses. In speaking this new language, learn to expand your vocabulary beyond explicit communication. Silence, for instance, can be used to great effect. By keeping quiet, not responding, you say a lot. By not mentioning something that people expect you to talk about, you call attention to this ellipsis. Make it communicate. Similarly, the details in a text, speech, or work of art have great expressive power. When the famous Roman lawyer and orator Cicero wanted to defame the character of someone he was prosecuting, he would not accuse or rant. Instead, he would mention details from the life of the accused, the incredible luxury of his home. Was it paid for out of illegal means? The lavishness of his parties, the style of his dress, the little signs that he considered himself superior to the average Roman. Cicero would say these things in passing, but the subtext was clear. Without hitting listeners over the head, it directed them to a certain conclusion. In war, almost everything is judged by its result. If a general leads his army to defeat, his noble intentions do not matter, nor does the fact that unforeseen factors may have thrown him off course. He lost. No excuse will do. You must learn to apply the same barometer to your attempts at communication and to those of other people. If a man says or writes something that he considers revolutionary, and that he hopes will change the world and improve mankind, but in the end, hardly anyone is affected in any real way, then it is not revolutionary or progressive at all. Communication that does not advance its cause or produce a desired result is just self-indulgent talk, reflecting no more than people's love of their own voice and of playing the role of the moral crusader. The ability to reach people and alter their opinions is a serious affair, as serious and strategic as war. You must be harsher on yourself and on others. Failure to communicate is the fault not of the dull-witted audience, but of the unstrategic communicator. Reversal. Even as you plan your communications to make them more consciously strategic, you must develop the reverse ability to decode the subtexts, hidden messages, and unconscious signals in what other people say. When people speak in vague generalities, for example, and use a lot of abstract terms like justice, morality, liberty, and so on, without really ever explaining the specifics of what they are talking about, they are almost always hiding something. This is often their own nasty but necessary actions which they prefer to cover up under a screen of righteous verbiage. When you hear such talk, be suspicious. In general, you must pay attention to the forms in which people express themselves. Never take their content at face value.